Hey guys, this is Pablo with Meditation Amsterdam, and in today's video I want to get into the mind's compulsive judgments of things as good or bad, and how that mechanism is not only compulsively driven by our egoic identity, but also very, very poor at predicting whether we can end up in the right place or having the experiences that we want. And straight off the bat, I want to start by sharing why that is the case and why I use the title of the video referring to a Ferris wheel. So the Ferris wheel is an analogy that came to mind a few days ago when thinking or rather having some reflection about the mechanism of passing judgment about whether something is good or bad. And what I realized is that the mechanism of judging something as good or bad makes one critical mistake. And it would be like trying to choose the best seat in a Ferris wheel. Now, lest you think that my big realization is that sometimes you're up in life and sometimes you're down, I wouldn't bore you with something as banal as that. Nor would I bore you with something as obvious as the fact that things change and things that were once good become not good because they decay, people behave differently or things of that kind. I think those are pretty obvious elements of why life changes and our judgments are tend to be rendered inoperative over time. What I want to share is something that to me at least was far more interesting, and it's the notion that we misunderstand the objective attributes of an object to be that which makes them good or bad, when in fact what makes an object good or bad is how that object sits in a certain context. And therefore the Ferris wheel analogy is excellent because see, if you were a kid and the Ferris wheel was standing still, you'd say, well, I want to sit at the seat which is at the top because that's the coolest one, right? That's first class, that's like the front seat or whatever. And little would you know that the Ferris wheel is going round and round. Now, the seat that you pick, if you manage to get the quote-unquote top seat, you'll soon come to realize that there was no such thing, that you picked a seat, and although you got the seat that you wanted, and it still has the same objective qualities, the context of the seat keeps changing all the time. I'm going to give you another example of this, which might make it even more obvious, and it became obvious to me when I thought about it on these terms, and it is something that happens to me every time I'm at an airport, and it just keeps happening over and over again. I'm a slow learner. I like to have coffee at airports, and very often I'll get a cup of coffee just before I'm about to board the plane. Now, that cup of coffee has certain objective attributes. It's full to the brim, it's really warm, it has delicious coffee, yeah, and those attributes make it an excellent cup of coffee. It's a source of nothing but pleasure if I'm sitting at the gate. The moment I have to board the plane with that exact same cup of coffee, it has become nothing but a nuisance. And in fact, the same attributes that made it pleasurable, which is being full and warm and all these kind of things, make it so that it is even more annoying, right? You are almost wishing that you have gotten half the coffee so you could drink it quickly, crush the thing, and put it put it inside the front seat, the seat in front of you, but you can't because it's full and it's hot. And now, call it lack of foresight, if you will, but this is precisely what gets us into trouble, because see, we tend to believe that we are judging objects correctly, and our judgments tend to be fairly permanent and fairly certain. We look at a person, we assess how they behave and this and that and the other, and we go, this is a goodie, that's a baddie. We look at an object and we go, oh, well, this is a phenomenal thing, I need to have it, right? And so on. And as context changes, people become either much more pleasurable, or let's use a rather nasty word, useful. And the same goes for objects and situations. There is no such thing as a permanently good or bad thing, no matter how much the mind would like that to be the case. And this brings us back to the mechanism of why that judgment is passed in the first place. So let's for a moment park the topic of context rather than attributes making for quote unquote good or bad, and go on to why we pass the judgment in the first place. The reason we pass the judgment is because we want things to pan out well for us. It's a compulsive need of the egoic identity to try to predict outcomes and manipulate circumstances to always come out on top. And what's interesting about that mechanism is that it is absolutely relentless. It is absolutely relentless in the sense that so long as we have not done a lot of self-cultivation and seen through the ego rather clearly, and not only seen through it, but actually chipped away at its automatic responses, we may as well assume that we are, in Nisargadatta Maharaj's words, completely dominated by it. And what the ego will do, because it can't predict or manage the full complexity of life. It can't. Life is way too large for the ego, which is why we feel inadequate. So what it'll do is it'll take snapshots of things, classify them based on memory, and get on with it. And that classification will, the ego feels a sense of certainty by putting something in the bucket of good or the bucket of bad, and it gives it a sort of sense of reassurance that it can estimate and it knows where it stands. Let's put it like that. And as I just mentioned at the start of the video, it just doesn't work that way, because contexts and fit to context is what dictates whether something is appropriate or not, whether something is comfortable or not, whether something is useful or not, and so on. So the question then becomes what to do. Well, one of the things that we can try to exercise is to watch our mind and its tendency to seek positionality, its tendency to seek the passing of judgment and the sticking to judgment, and to making that judgment emotionally fixed or fixated, so to speak, and how much we get a kick out of that, right? If you are praising someone, you'll get a kick out of like, oh, I know that this is a good person and that's admirable and the rest of that. If you're criticizing someone, you'll get a kick out of your self-righteousness. It doesn't matter if you judge for good or bad. It's the judging action that creates that that little reward that the ego gives you, because now it knows what to do with that object, right? So if a person is quote unquote good, well, then I'm gonna seek that person, and if they are good in a way that is, protective and effective and assertive or whatever, then I'm going to seek them to seek solace and let's say take comfort in the shade that they extend through their drive and their determination and their assertiveness and all that kind of business. If the person is good in a way that is very passive or mild or whatnot, then I might seek them in order to make myself feel like I'm the dominant one in the interaction, or you name it, right? So what matters is the extraction of validation and gratification. What shape that takes doesn't really matter to the ego, and it'll classify people in those buckets. And people that are good for nothing, it'll just ignore, right? Like I can't. This is an interesting one. I was speaking with someone that I've been working with for quite a few months now, and that person was sharing that his grandmother was perhaps the most significant person in his life. And then we got into talking about how the ego will obsess about getting validation from people in the way that I just mentioned, and it'll try to find out if it's someone that you need to run away from, someone that you can physically or mentally dominate, someone that you want to procreate with. You know, fight, flight, or, you know, third F, right? And everybody else will be deemed completely irrelevant. So you'll have, you know, jocks and wimps and hot chicks, and everybody else is just not relevant. And I said to him, isn't it ironic that the person who was most significant for you would have fallen in that others bucket, the ones that we have no use for? Though that's the one that actually touched his heartstrings and really showed him what love was all about. So it's a very impoverished life, one lived in this constant seeking for gratification and extraction of value, or being cool by association and all that kind of business. It's an incredibly hungry and engaging in beggarship to kind of get what we feel that we don't have. And yet, so long as there is body identity, that is the essential nature that we have. It may be covered under very sophisticated layers, actually, right? You may be a pillar of society with a happy wife and a home and the rest of that stuff. And yet, you can tell that when circumstances are not what you want them to be, there's something that starts to scream inside for you to take action, and it very often even become unrecognizable to yourself by your attempts at let's say crawling back to the warm side of the pool and making sure that things pan out all right for you. So this is the state of affairs. It's a state in which judgment is executed in order for us to predict and manipulate in a way that we and ours benefit from it. Speaking of ours, and apologies if I already mentioned that in this video, but I had to re-record because the sound was acting up again, same as last video, so I had to re-record. But speaking of ours, it's interesting that in pop psychology, the be-all and end-all is to go from dopamine to serotonin, whereas in fact serotonin is, you know, just another cocktail, right? We're still dependent on the feel good to dictate what we do. And I came across an interesting study the other day indicating that serotonin is indeed the feel good and bonding and wholesome hormone, but it is feel good to what we consider to be us and our, or ours, right? Our tribe, our group. It's an in-group bonding hormone. And because it is that, its effect towards the out-group is of hatred. Isn't that interesting? So we have to be very careful with these things. We have to be very careful where we plant our loyalties and where we just acquire a more sophisticated form of ego that feels wholesome to the senses and to the emotions, and that is applauded by society. When in reality, if that is not accompanied with a broadening of our sense of self and our sphere of concern, it could be actually also a very dangerous thing. So I leave you with that little piece of info. If it's not correct, I'd be happy to hear about it. That's something that I heard online, so I don't want to also be sharing things that might not be completely accurate. Fair disclosure. I'm not a scientist. And at any rate, I'm still very curious about what you guys make of this video, and especially about this notion of objective attributes being rendered good or bad based on context, and how the ego seems to ignore that in its operation. Also, as usual, if you think that this content could benefit others, then you're liking, sharing, and subscribing. Makes it more available out there, and it's also very motivating. So thanks for listening. I'll be back with more videos pretty soon. Cheerio. Bye-bye.